What you can't see still leaves footprints in the silence of the night.
The air in my parents' attic was heavy with dust and silence, broken only by the creak of wooden planks under my feet. It had been years since I'd set foot up here. Now, with the news of their move to Florida, it fell on me to clear out the old family relics. I was flipping through a box of photographs when something froze me mid-motion, a picture of my 6th birthday party, a memory I could recall vividly. There we were, the whole family and my best friend Jake, gathered around the cake. Except, someone else was there. In the corner of the photograph, a man stood half-shrouded in shadow. His face was pale and oddly out of focus, though everyone else appeared crystal clear. My breath hitched as I leaned closer. I didn't recognize him. He wasn't in any of the other photos from that day, just this one. And yet, the more I stared, the more familiar he seemed. To say my life was uneventful would be an understatement. I lived in a small New England town called Milton, one of those places with a main street full of antique shops and diners that hadn't updated their menus since the 80s. I worked as a freelance graphic designer, which was a polite way of saying I spent most of my time in sweatpants, hunched over a laptop in my apartment above the old bookstore. My social circle was limited to the occasional video call with my sister Beth, who lived in California, and the bi-weekly trivia night at Marv's Tavern. My parents had retired to a condo in Florida, leaving behind the house I grew up in, a creaking colonial that always felt a little too big and a little too quiet. They'd offered to sell it, but I convinced them to hold off. Nostalgia's a funny thing. That morning, I'd driven to the house armed with a thermos of coffee and a playlist of true crime podcasts. I told myself it was just a quick cleanup, a chance to clear out the attic before the snow set in. But as I sat on the attic floor surrounded by boxes of faded memories, I realized how much of our past we'd stuffed away and forgotten. Old toys, yellowing newspapers, a stack of Polaroids from long-abandoned vacations. And then there was the man in the photo. I placed the picture on the floor, next to a few others I'd pulled from the same box. My eyes scanned every inch, trying to rationalize his presence. Maybe he was a neighbor or a family friend I'd forgotten. Maybe he was just a trick of the light, some smudge on the film. But the deeper I stared, the more unnerving it became. His face wasn't just out of focus, it was blurred in a way that felt unnatural, like a glitch in a digital file. His features seemed to shift when I looked away, as if they refused to be pinned down. The air around me seemed to grow colder, though the afternoon sun poured through the small attic window. I shook it off, blaming the drafty house and my overactive imagination. "This is ridiculous," I muttered aloud. My voice sounded small in the empty attic. I shoved the photo back into the box and stood, brushing dust off my jeans. But as I turned to leave, a faint creak echoed behind me. I froze. It was probably nothing, a house this old groaned at the slightest movement. Still, I found myself glancing back at the boxes. The photograph I just buried was lying on top again, the man's blurred face seeming to leer up at me. I left the attic with a nervous laugh, telling myself I was being ridiculous. By the time I got back to the kitchen, the sun had dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the room. I poured myself a glass of water, hoping to shake off the unease. That's when I heard it. A soft creak echoed from upstairs. Not the random groan of an old house settling, but something deliberate. Like footsteps. I froze, my pulse thudding in my ears. "Hello?" My voice came out shaky, too quiet to carry far. Of course, there was no response. I grabbed the nearest thing that could serve as a weapon, a rusted candlestick from the kitchen counter, and edged toward the staircase. The air felt heavier as I climbed, each step creaking under my weight. When I reached the attic door, it was ajar, though I was sure I'd closed it. Slowly, I pushed it open. The attic was just as I'd left it, boxes stacked haphazardly, dust motes dancing in the dim light. But something felt off. The box with the photos was on its side, its contents spilled across the floor. And there, in the center of the mess, was the photo of my 6th birthday. The man's blurred face stared up at me, more distinct now, his features sharpening like something coming into focus. I backed out of the attic and slammed the door shut, heart pounding. Downstairs, I locked the front door and bolted the windows for good measure. The photo was just a trick of the light, I told myself. Maybe I'd accidentally knocked the box over. It was nothing. But deep down, I didn't believe it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind outside, sent my nerves spiraling. Around midnight, I gave up trying and grabbed my laptop, hoping to distract myself. I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the photo. Who was he? Why was he there? On a whim, I searched for local stories from the time the photo was taken. Most were mundane: a new library opening, a local softball team winning a championship. But then I stumbled upon something that made my stomach drop: a missing persons report from the same week as my 6th birthday. A man named George Whitaker had disappeared without a trace. His photo stared back at me from the screen, and my blood ran cold. It was him. The same blurred face from the picture, now clear and sharp in the grainy black and white newspaper photo. My thoughts raced. How could someone who disappeared decades ago show up in an old family photo? None of it made sense. My hands shook as I clicked through article after article, piecing together the story. George Whitaker had been last seen near Milton, walking along the road late at night. Witnesses claimed he'd seemed disoriented, as if he were lost or in some kind of trance. My heart jumped as a loud thud sounded from upstairs. It wasn't the usual creak or groan, it was heavy, deliberate. The sound of something being dropped. I grabbed the candlestick again and crept up the stairs, adrenaline propelling me forward despite every fiber of my being screaming to run. When I reached the attic door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The silence on the other side was deafening. Taking a deep breath, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The air inside was icy, and the single bulb overhead flickered weakly. At first glance, everything looked the same: boxes stacked, photos scattered. But then I noticed it: the photo of my 6th birthday was now pinned to the wall with a rusty nail, right at eye level. My knees nearly buckled. The man's face wasn't blurred anymore. It was clear as day. His pale, sunken eyes seemed to stare straight into mine, and his lips curled in a faint, sinister smile. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a loose floorboard. That's when I saw something else: a faint smear of dirt leading across the floorboards, as if someone had dragged a heavy bag. The trail ended abruptly at the far wall. My breath came in shallow gasps as I approached the wall, dread pooling in my stomach. The wall was solid wood, except for a small, square panel at its base, something I'd never noticed before. Slowly, I knelt and pulled it open. A gust of cold air hit me, and I recoiled at the smell: damp earth and decay. The darkness beyond the panel seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowing the weak beam of my flashlight. Something moved. It was subtle, a shifting shadow in the blackness, but it was enough to send me scrambling back. I slammed the panel shut and ran out of the attic, locking the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, every light in the house blazing. The hours crawled by, the shadows on the walls growing longer and darker. When dawn finally broke, I felt no relief. Sleep was out of the question, so I returned to the attic as soon as the sun was fully up. The photo was gone. The wall panel was still shut, but the dirt trail had disappeared. It was as if nothing had happened. But as I turned to leave, my foot nudged something on the floor. It was another photo, one I hadn't seen before. It was of my parents' wedding day, decades before I was born. Everyone looked young and happy, except for the man standing in the background, his pale face and sunken eyes unmistakable. It was George Whitaker. The morning light did little to ease my nerves. I sat at the kitchen table, the wedding photo of my parents spread out before me. George Whitaker stood in the background, his expression unreadable, his presence impossible. The same question churned in my mind. Who was he, and what did he want? Desperate for answers, I called my sister, Beth. She picked up on the second ring, her voice groggy with sleep. What's going on? It's 6 a.m. here. I need to ask you something, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Do you remember anyone unusual being around when we were kids? Someone who wasn't family? What kind of question is that? She asked, now fully awake. You mean like a babysitter? No, I snapped, frustration bubbling over. I mean someone strange. Someone who didn't belong. Beth was quiet for a moment. When she finally spoke, her tone was cautious. You're scaring me, Sarah. What's this about? I hesitated, then told her everything. The man in the photos, the attic, the wall panel. Her silence on the other end was deafening. You need to leave that house, she said finally. Right now. Her urgency unnerved me. Do you know something I don't? Beth sighed. Mom mentioned once, years ago, that something felt wrong about that house. She said she'd hear noises at night, things moving on their own. Dad always brushed it off, said it was just the old place settling. But now, I'm wondering. Wondering what? She said she found a photo once. A man she didn't recognize, standing in the background of a Christmas picture. She threw it away, but I guess, her voice faltered. I guess he came back. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Why didn't she say anything? She didn't want to scare us. But Sarah, you need to leave. Don't mess with this. I wanted to argue, but Beth's words clung to me like smoke. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was time to pack up and go. But something inside me resisted, the need for closure, for answers. If I left now, I'd never know the truth. By nightfall, I was back in the attic, armed with a flashlight and a crowbar. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to leave, but curiosity and fear drove me forward. The wall panel loomed before me, its edges warped and stained. My hands trembled as I pried it open. The stench hit me first, rot and damp earth. I shone the flashlight into the dark space beyond, revealing a narrow tunnel carved into the foundation of the house. The dirt walls were uneven, clawed at by hands or tools I didn't want to imagine. It stretched on for what felt like forever, swallowing the light. Okay, I whispered to myself. Just a quick look. I crawled into the tunnel, the air growing colder and wetter with each inch. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of my own breathing deafening in the confined space. The walls felt alive, pressing in on me, stealing the air from my lungs. About 10 feet in, the tunnel opened into a small chamber. My flashlight flickered, but I saw enough to send me reeling. Photos, hundreds of them, covered the walls, each one pinned with rusty nails. They were all of my family, birthdays, vacations, holidays. And in every single one, George Whitaker was there. Sometimes in the background, sometimes front and center, his hollow eyes fixed on the camera. At the center of the chamber was an old, wooden chair, its arms worn smooth. A thick, leather strap dangled from one side, as if someone, or something, had been restrained there. Scratches marred the floor around it, desperate and chaotic. Then I heard it, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Sarah. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The shadows in the tunnel shifted, moving against the light. A figure emerged, crawling toward me on all fours. It was George, his face pale and decayed, his eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. His mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. Stay away. I screamed, scrambling backward. My flashlight slipped from my grasp, plunging the chamber into darkness. The air filled with the sound of his breathing, wet and ragged. Then he was on me. His cold, clammy hands closed around my wrists, pinning me to the ground. His face was inches from mine, his breath rancid. You invited me, he rasped, his voice like grinding gravel. You opened the door. I thrashed, kicking and clawing, but his grip was unyielding. Images flooded my mind, his disappearance, his lonely death, and the way his spirit had been trapped, bound to my family through some dark, ancient force. We had been his torment, his obsession, and now, his escape. With a burst of adrenaline, I broke free, grabbing the flashlight and slamming it into his face. He let out an inhuman screech, the sound reverberating through the chamber. I didn't wait to see if he would recover. I bolted back through the tunnel, dirt raining down on me as the walls seemed to close in. When I burst into the attic, I slammed the panel shut and threw a heavy box on top of it. My chest heaved as I locked the attic door and stumbled into the hallway. The house was eerily silent, but I knew better than to trust it. As I grabbed my keys and fled into the night, I glanced back at the house one last time. In the attic window, a shadowy figure watched me go, his yellow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I drove aimlessly for hours, the distant hum of the highway blending with the thundering of my heartbeat. The events of the night played in a loop, each moment sharpening the terror I couldn't shake. I couldn't go back to the house, not after what I'd seen. I needed answers, real answers. But the person who might have them was over 1,000 miles away. Beth answered on the first ring, her voice tight with worry. Where are you? Are you safe? I'm fine, I lied, gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white. But I need to know everything. About the house. About George. There was a pause, and I could hear her shifting, as though trying to find the right words. I don't know much. Just what Mom told me, that there were things she couldn't explain. But Sarah, you need to let this go. Get out of Milton. Don't look back. Her words only fueled my resolve. Beth, I'm not leaving until I know the truth. If Mom knew something, she kept it from us. I need to know why. Silence again, then a defeated sigh. Okay. Call Aunt Ruth. She was around more back then. She might know something. I found Aunt Ruth living in a small retirement community just outside of Boston. She greeted me with cautious curiosity, her sharp blue eyes scanning my face as I explained everything. She listened without interrupting, her lips pressed into a thin line. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression grave. I was afraid this would happen. What do you mean? I asked, leaning forward. You knew about him? She nodded slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for her tea. George Whitaker wasn't a stranger to your family. He was part of it. My stomach dropped. What are you talking about? Back in the 1920s, your great-grandparents owned that house. George was a tenant. They rented out the attic to make ends meet during the Depression. He was quiet, kept to himself. But something about him wasn't right. He became obsessed with the family, especially your great-grandmother. He started showing up in their photos, uninvited to events, always lurking in the background. I shuddered, remembering his face in my photos. What happened to him? One night, he just disappeared. Some said he moved on, but your great-grandfather, he suspected otherwise. He was a superstitious man, believed in curses and spirits. He claimed George had cursed the family when they forced him out, binding himself to the house and the bloodline. I felt the weight of her words pressing down on me. You're saying this thing has been following us for generations? Ruth nodded grimly. Every so often, he shows up in the photos, always when the family is at its weakest. Your mother tried to ignore it, but she knew. And now, it's your turn. I returned to the house against every instinct screaming for me to stay away. Something about Aunt Ruth's story gnawed at me. If George was bound to the family, why did he choose now to reveal himself so openly? And what did he want from me? The house loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette framed by the rising moon. Inside, the air was thick with the same oppressive stillness I'd felt in the attic. I made my way upstairs, flashlight in hand, determined to face whatever was waiting for me. The attic was just as I'd left it, the wall panel still blocked by the box. But the air felt colder, heavier, like something was watching me. I moved the box aside and opened the panel, the smell of damp earth hitting me like a wave. This time, I didn't hesitate. I crawled into the tunnel, the narrow walls pressing against my shoulders. The chamber was as I'd left it, the photos still pinned to the walls. But there was something new, a single Polaroid sitting on the chair. With trembling hands, I picked it up. The photo was of me, taken from behind, crouched over the tunnel entrance. My blood ran cold as I realized it wasn't a photo of the past, it was of me now. Someone, or something, had been in the attic, watching me. Then I noticed something else. On the back of the Polaroid, scrawled in shaky handwriting, were 2 words, "Look deeper." I turned back to the wall of photos, scanning each one with mounting dread. That's when I saw it. George wasn't the only one in the pictures. Hidden in the background, sometimes barely visible, were others. Dozens of faces, blurred and shadowy, all watching. And then it hit me. They weren't just random people, they were family. My family. Faces I recognized from old albums, now twisted and hollow. They weren't just victims of George's curse, they were the curse. The whispers began again, louder now, surrounding me in a deafening cacophony. The photos on the walls began to shake, the nails pulling free as the images floated toward me. George's face appeared on every one, his hollow eyes burning into mine. "You invited me," his voice echoed, low and guttural. But I was never alone. The chamber began to collapse, the walls crumbling as shadows poured in like liquid smoke. Faces emerged from the darkness, twisted and grotesque, their mouths open in silent screams. They reached for me, their cold hands grasping at my skin. I scrambled back through the tunnel, the voices growing louder, more desperate. When I finally burst into the attic, the house itself seemed to shudder. The whispers followed me, a relentless tide of despair. As I fled into the night, I realized the horrifying truth: George wasn't the curse. He was the anchor, the only thing keeping the others at bay. By confronting him, I'd broken that fragile balance. Now, the curse wasn't bound to the house or the family. It was bound to me. And there was no escaping it.